So I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar on the future of local employment services. My name is Jonathan Barr, and I'm the Deputy Head of the Division and Head of Local Employment and Skills Unit within the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions, and Cities. Within the OECD, we're a one-stop shop looking at place-based employment and skills policies and really looking at the need to move beyond national averages and looking at regional disparities in labor market outcomes. This webinar is being organized within the framework of the OECD Local Development Forum, which is our global network of policy practitioners working on employment, skills, and economic development issues. This webinar is being co-organized with WAPES, which is the World Association of Public Employment Services, and we thank them a lot for the good collaboration that we've had them so far. So today's webinar, we have a global lineup of speakers spanning from Australia to Europe and the US. And we want to make it as interactive as possible. So you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom link, there's a Q&A and a chat box. So as we go through the webinar, we'd encourage you to enter your questions and enter your comments in the chat box. Equally, participants are able to like different questions and comments, and the questions that get the most likes will go to the top, and we'll try to address those as we moved through the webinar. So what we're going to do to start off is I would like to welcome Karen Mcguire, who's the head of the Local Employment Skills and Social Innovation Division, who's going to set the context for us around this webinar on the future of local employment services. Karen, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jonathan, and greetings to all, and apologies to our Spanish speakers who I see have posted some questions. Unfortunately, this is only available in English today. So I thought I would just give a very quick context overview to help give some background for the discussion. I'm just gonna share my screen here real quick so we can see the slides as I speak here. So as Jonathan mentioned, we support something called the LEAD program, which focuses on local economic and employment development. And we have a range of issues. We talk about employment and skills, but also just to let you know, the program covers considerations with the social economy and social innovation, issues of inclusive entrepreneurship, which is also a tool that can be supported for those seeking employment. And how to help transition local economies, as well as different aspects of integrated local development, whether it's culture as a driver of job creation and innovation, or any other sector that has a strong local dimension. I just wanted to reiterate what Jonathan said, that this local development forum, and we're really great to have all of you with us today, is that it is a gateway for us to both hear from you and to incorporate what you're saying into the OECD research, and also for us to communicate a little bit what we've been doing for your feedback. So this is an opportunity, and we look forward to the different questions and discussions in order to support broader OECD work in this area. So we're grateful to have you join us. Background before we get to the current COVID situation, but if you look at what local labor market health was like 10 years after the last crisis, of course some of our databases we have a challenge going across all countries with time frame, but if you look at least at the last decade afterwards, you see that as Jonathan said, if you zoom beyond the national averages, we get quite a different picture. So OECD-wide, before the outbreak, we had record low unemployment rates. So everyone was celebrating this achievement. But if you dig a little deeper, you saw that actually, if you look across, the hundreds of OECD regions, that actually a third of those regions had lost net employment. So there were fewer jobs than in 2018 than they were in 2008. A second fact I wanted to highlight is that almost half of OECD regions had not actually recovered to the pre-2008 crisis unemployment levels. So there was still a lot of challenges in addressing not only the crisis and its immediate results, but also longer term structural change. A third fact I just want to mention is that actually the share of the unemployed that were in long-term unemployment, so those that are the most hard to serve, had actually grown in 2/3 of OECD regions. And if this is what we saw with the last crisis, in this case, we're very concerned going forward about those that are going to be suffering from some entrenched challenges in the labor market. So if we think about how this crisis may be a little bit different from past crises, well, first, the scale is much deeper. If you look at unemployment jumps in those countries that don't have currently short-time work schemes, if you look at the number of hours worked, and also the sort of hitting countries and regions rather simultaneously. This is quite remarkable relative to last time, where we could really see in our analyses the sort of hits occurring at different time periods and different time lags. A second important difference we want to highlight here is that the sort of place dimension, the urban-rural dimension, might be a bit different this time around, and we'll talk in a minute about why that might be. But typically, cities take a hit up front and then bounce back relatively quicker, and rural areas might not take as big a hit, but might take a bit longer to recover. Dynamics might be a bit different this time. Another consideration is the sector dynamics of this crisis. And, you know, in the last crisis, we saw tourism, for example, as a tool for helping with the recovery and helping employ a lot of people, including low skilled. And this time around, given the massive hits to the sector, that won't be the immediate solution for many places. Another characteristic is really the kind of people that are affected. So, of course, the usual suspects with any crisis in terms of youth and the low skilled, but also given the sectors that are being hit, unlike sort of long-term structural change where you saw a lot of losses for those sectors where men were more greatly represented, here we're seeing much greater sectoral hits hitting women. Excuse me, go back up there. Another issue is just digitalization automation. And while this occurs after every crisis, given the unusual circumstances associated with the pandemic and the need for what people call social distancing, maybe we should call physical distancing, is that it's going to supercharge, in a sense, some of those trends. So if we take a look at, we think that, COVID-19 is like a tsunami that's hit us, but there were a lot of undercurrents that were already in place affecting local labor markets. And the COVID-19 is going to have some differing effects on those trends. So just to go through those a little bit, first, as we talked about with automation and digitalization, that's going to be greatly accelerated. What it means is that some places where we were anticipating maybe some future job loss over time, that's going to happen a lot quicker. And across OECD regions, the difference is between 4 and 40% of jobs that are at risk of automation, given the nature of the tasks at hand. Another is the unprecedented and rapid expansion of the use of teleworking, not only for what it means for thinking about the geography of jobs, but also for the delivery of public employment services and what that means for how to support different groups and whether they have access to internet and are able to be served as effectively through these kinds of electronic means. Also, of course, hits to sort of bricks and mortar type shops, and thinking about e-commerce and what that means for a lot of firms where you actually have a concentration in some of the stronger and larger online platforms. This also does create opportunities, however, that we should all be thinking about, I think, in the discussion. In terms of globalization, of course, we've seen world trade plummet. What might happen that we need to think about in terms of local employment is just perhaps some limited relocalization in supply chains. Now, supply chains don't change overnight. We don't expect them to. However, if there is any trend, it's likely to be thinking about how to build that redundancy and maybe have more localized suppliers, which can create new economic development and employment opportunities. In terms of the green transition, we're going to already have seen some shift in consumer preferences for greener products, but the massive stimulus packages and green investments that governments are making now will have an impact on what kinds of jobs and skills will be needed. There will be, however, perhaps some tensions between preserving those jobs at any cost, given the massive, overwhelming need for employment, and then the longer term goal of transitioning some sectors. And while it might be a bit easier to predict where those job losses are likely to occur in those regions that have a lot of carbon intensive sectors, the localization of where the new green jobs will come from is perhaps a bit less easy to predict. If we look at labor supply, thinking about long-term trends in terms of aging, especially in most OECD economies, this broad demographic trends are unlikely to radically change. However, we might see a bit of a change in the demographics in particular local areas, such as in rural or intermediate areas not super far from cities, where we also see an opportunity to attract new workers, but also to retain younger residents and attract younger residents. Urbanization, we've seen, of course, this long-term trend. It's faster in some countries than others, but still this sort of trend to moving to the largest cities. And that's going to be a little bit of a question for us that we're exploring at the OECD and how that plays out. And of course, what are these new opportunities that we mentioned with respect to other kinds of places? And then, of course, considerations with migration and the availability of different labor supplies. And I know a lot of countries are thinking about what to do, for example, seasonal workers in agriculture, in addition to the sort of student populations and other workers that are coming from abroad. So just to wrap up here, I think, one thing that we are focusing on in the OECD, and we have in the past, and with the crisis, we'll be looking even more into, is how to make sure that the local services for public employment are sort of fit for the task, given the overwhelming scale that they're going to be facing, and given the potentially more challenging populations to serve. And in particular, the need for these local partnerships with wraparound services to help those that are going to be the most challenged. And we have been, of course, looking across the institutional frameworks of OECD countries and how they organize things. And we're lucky today to have on the panel representatives from a different range of country examples, whether they are a national ministry or agency that has a local branch, which is true in a lot of systems, but also those that are provided networks of external providers, private and or public and nonprofit, those that are fully decentralized in terms of the delivery, for example, in the US, and those that are maybe a bit more shared competencies depending on the target group and the other considerations. So we just wanted to give a few opening thoughts to frame the discussion. And again, just thanks again to WAPES for co-sponsoring this event. And we look forward to all of your questions and all of the panelists' interventions.
Great, thanks a lot, Karen. So I'd like to ask the panelists to turn on their videos, please. Great, so Karen's set the helpful context for us, and now we just want to go through the different panelists and talk about their experiences. So let's start with Scott Eichner, who's the Administrator for Workforce Services with the Montana Department of Labor and Industry in the United States. So Scott, it'd be great if we could get your perspective. How have workforce development programs in Montana had to adapt to COVID-19 given the massive labor market shock that it sent? And how are programs being organized to deal with recruitment in essential sectors? We know that even though there's been massive job losses, there has been recruitment in some sectors. So it'd be great if you could talk to us about the experiences in Montana.
Sure, absolutely. Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon there, so it's morning where I am. Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm more than sharing. I'm actually looking forward to hearing what everybody else has to say. But yeah, this has been interesting. The speed of the onset of the pandemic and the initial lockdown First, everything we do to an effort to support economic stabilization across the United States, which for the public workforce system and everything became unemployment like that. And that brought its challenges. We always support claimants, workforce always supports employment. And there's a deliberate connection, intentional connection between those two programs, but nothing in a sense of what was needed when the pandemic hit. There were some challenges there, but also brought some blessings. And that you can still look at now. And one of the things that it did was because everything transitioned to unemployment so quickly, we had a chance to sit back and think about what we're going to need to do when claims volume starts to come down. At some point, we go back to something more into normal. What is that going to look like for workforce? So it gave us a chance to rethink things, in particular remote service, alternative service delivery, right? Doing things not in person. And to some degree, we'd always done that, but it was always kind of the third or fourth option, right? Our default was always, hey, come into the office, come talk to us, let's do this in person. We have a network of offices spread out across the state. States all have their own network of offices spread out across the state, and the general business model has always been in person. So it gives us a chance to rethink some things. In the moment, access came a big deal in, right? Is there broadband? And Karen had mentioned some of this. What does connectivity look like? Do you have a computer? Do you have a device, mobile phone? Do we have apps and opportunities that you can engage through different varieties of technology? If not, how are we going to help you? What do those types of things look like? Short-term part of the blessing was the inspiration to think differently on what we did. It forced us to embrace reality. In some ways, that was an opportunity. I viewed it as an opportunity to overcome some policy stuff. We had leeway to work around some policy things that maybe didn't necessarily make sense in this moment. Work around to focus on some system stuff and some procedural stuff, maybe bigger with some of the culture things that because our nature for 80 years has been in-person service, forcing those people to think differently about that, to culturally embrace, well, we don't have a choice, we have to do it. How do you be more engaging from a distance? Maybe even a bit more proactive. Our system generally, we have these physical offices, and the business model is generally we wait for people to come in and engage with us. And so this forced us, we couldn't wait to do that because the offices were closed. So how do we go find customers? How do we get to them? Which is some of those things, you know, it's the blessing in the curse that has been really good for us. For business customers, we had to reevaluate, and we continue to reevaluate what our value is in this moment. We've talked about things like subject matter expertise around remote engagement tools. Here in Montana, 97% of our employers have less than 20 employees. And so providing a subject matter expert who could talk to them about, hey, here are all the various remote engagement tools. Here's what you need to know about them. That type of stuff was a good service that we could provide in that moment, and probably will continue for a while. Becoming the connection to state and federal funding things that have come out to support business in this moment, right? That again, small business, where do they go? There's a whole bunch of information out there, but you have to read it. And if you're trying to run your business too, it's hard to synthesize through that. We could provide staff. That's one of the ways we could provide value to people, to those businesses, was to help them navigate that and understand what their business was. And we have so much information, so much data on everybody. We were able to do that. Also becoming better recruiting experts. We've always done recruiting. We've always done sourcing to an extent, but this is less about posting a job and finding people who are qualified for that. It's needing to understand the situation that employer is in right now, what they think it's going to look like short term, and where they want it to go long term, and then helping figure out a recruiting strategy around that. Clearly, long term, I think the biggest thing for me is trying to understand how this changes the expectations of our customers. Right? We have changed our own expectations in short term. But what's it going to mean for our customers? We've shown them they don't have to come into the office now. Do we even need brick and mortar offices? Should everything be remote? Should the place that we start our default service delivery position be virtual and remote access, and have the third or fourth option be in person now? What are our customers going to be willing to do? And what are they going to be not willing to do because we forced them into a different reality? Understanding what that means for our infrastructure, for our brick and mortar offices, the amount of money that we're paying into those things right now, where we've shown we can do it a different way. Those types of things are going to be really huge, and we're talking about them. I won't sit here and tell you we've solved all that, but that's part of what we're trying to figure out that I think this has the potential to absolutely change the paradigm of what the nature of our entire service delivery model looks like. In terms of the adapting to the essential sectors that Jonathan had asked about, Karen had mentioned the biggest thing for sectors. Montana's a big hospitality and tourism state that got crushed with a pandemic, and that was just the summer season going into winter season. It doesn't look any better, so it may not get any worse, but it's probably not going to get better. And we are at our employment level for that industry sector. We're at half of what we were a year ago, and that's probably not coming back anytime soon. And finding jobs for those people is tough because they want to go back to what they did, right? That's been interesting. It's just been an interesting dynamic. Some of the other ones, oil and gas, somebody mentioned oil and gas has been, and fossil fuels, coal, that type of thing has been interesting for us, had some interesting impacts, pretty significant impacts. Meat processing, we've had significant impacts. We have a lot of cows in the state, but we have no large meat processing plants in the state. And with the lockdown, the stuff that went on, it was, what do you do with that? So trying to figure some of those things out. Real quick though, one of the other places that we've really seen trouble we're having some angst, I guess, is the non-essential functions, remote work. Montana is an attractive place for remote work, for teleworkers to move to. Most of those are high-paying, high-skilled jobs, but there's an expectation. You build out communities, you bring people in, you got to have other services that you can provide them, sector services, right? Food service, all those types of things, grocery stores and gas stations, and we don't have enough people to fill those. So if we get an influx if you use that as an economic development strategy and you get an influx of those folks, how do you fill the support jobs that are going to be needed in order to keep them there, to keep them happy, to be able to meet the needs and wants that those individuals have? So that's been really interesting. That trickles down into all kinds of stuff, the remote aspect of that, and then again the broadband and a lot of the support things that come into it. So no different than you guys, a fascinating time, but also a lot of opportunity to rethink what we do and maybe try some new stuff and create a new reality and a new opportunity for all of us.
Great, thanks a lot, Scott, for that. I think at the beginning of your comments, some people were having audio problems, so we apologize for that, but everything seems to be working now fine, so that's great. Thanks a lot, Scott, for that information. So I'd like to turn now to Stefan Heuke. Stefan works as the Deputy Director for International Affairs within the Federal Employment Agency in Germany. So Stefan, it'd be great if you could, reflecting on what Scott said, talk to us, what have been the main challenges confronted by employment services in Germany as a result of COVID-19, and how are services in particular being scaled to regions that might be facing higher unemployment difficulties? Over to you. You're Stefan, you're on mute, so you need to unmute your.
Click again. Now it should work. Thank you, Jonathan. Perfect. To answer your second question briefly and perhaps a little surprisingly, all our efforts were targeted to avoid that situation, that a particular region, be it being impacted directly by COVID or by the impact of COVID on special industries, we try to avoid these regions being hit by high levels of unemployment at our costs. From the early days of lockdown, we at the Federal Employment Agency, we saw our main challenge in the short-term delivery of massive financial aids for businesses, especially short work allowance, the famous Kurzarbeitergeld, everybody knows that about, I guess, for furloughed workers. That particular instrument has been crucial in coping successfully with the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. Funds were not a problem in the short term, as we had reserves of about 26 billion euros alone when the lockdown started. So what we needed basically was organizational firepower to facilitate that. So only if in a few weeks and by central decision by our management board here in Nuremberg, we reallocated and trained more than 10,000 volunteers from various services and from the local offices throughout the whole organization to upscale the existing centralized service units that process employer subsidies, upscaling their capacity from about 900 FTE, 900 staff, to 11,000 FTE. We thereby managed to provide reliable online and phone counseling, remote, for more than 800,000 businesses seeking support, as well as rapid processing and cash disbursement for more than 18 billion euros for up to 7 million employees this day. So the main approach was to centralize, to avoid any region being hit in the labor market directly and massively, and perhaps extraordinary from the perspective of the region by the COVID crisis. Another main goal was to protect our staff and enabling those with family duties to work from home. So we upscaled the work from home infrastructure capacity from up to 50% of staff, which is about 45,000 people, also in a couple of weeks. About 25% of staff still work from home. However, all that comes at the price. Many services, individual employer councils, vocational guidance, counseling, placement services, recruitment services, all these things Scott talked about, were significantly downscaled in all regions or even completely suspended, especially those that require personal contact with customers. Scott talked about this too. So we had to cancel hundreds of thousands of initial counseling sessions for newly unemployed customers, or instead of personal appointments, conduct them by telephone or video. We even haven't fully ID'd many new customers yet because we haven't seen them in person. So the reopening of our so-called customer centers, they are basically the front offices of our local agencies, still tentative, and perhaps we shall never see a scope of personal contact to our customers like pre-corona ever again. Top priority remains at the present time providing maximum safety and security of our staff and our customers by avoiding any unnecessary exposition to corona-related infection risks. The heads of our local agencies have discretion to decide locally about further openings and gradually re-establishing the enforcement of personal appearances of job seekers. This was also mostly suspended during the past months, which eased pressure on job seekers during the crisis. So taking stock of our response to COVID, I believe we are quite successful with our firefighting with the short work allowance scheme. The flip side of this success, at least temporarily, has been a significant loss of service delivery volume to our local agencies, of service delivery scale and scope, and the loss of contact to all of our local customers and personal interaction. Perhaps we can talk about the long-term effects of this in the Q&A. So that's briefly all for me.
Great, thanks a lot, Stefan. So just a reminder to our participants, whoever is online right now, that we definitely welcome questions. So if you have questions to any of our speakers, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. So we started in the US, early morning in the US, then we went to afternoon in Europe and Germany, and now we're going to late night in Australia. So Annette, we'll turn to you. We have Annette Gill, who's the Principal Policy Advisor with the National Employment Services Association of Australia. NESA has been a long-standing partner of the OECD Local Development Forum. So Annette, it'd be great if you could talk. We know digital technology is becoming an increasingly important channel around employment services delivery. What's being done in Australia around digital delivery? And more importantly, does digital delivery work for all places and regions?
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you for having me here today. It's okay. Look, yes, technology has been having an increasingly important role across the economy and employment services for some time. So it's not a new phenomenon, but it was certainly the importance of technology has certainly increased with the pandemic. And I have to say our current system has been digitally enabled for some time. We introduced quite a sophisticated platform in early 2000s, which is the engine room of our employment services structure. We have a totally outsourced system. We have around 300 providers delivering various employment service programs from around 5,000 offices across Australia. This platform ensures that all of the work going on everywhere is actually recorded in a central repository, and that data and information can be used for improvement, continuity of services and work through. We're in a current reform stage here in Australia now, and we're looking to expand digital service delivery rather than enabled delivery going forward. I'll just give you a little bit of a snapshot about our current digital platform that enables the frontline delivery and is a very important part of the overall performance management of the whole outsourced employment system. So the employment services system, which we refer to as ESS, is an interactive system. It allows not only the collection of data, but it allows that data and information to be shared between agencies, departments, and providers. It holds the details of every single job seeker engaged in employment services, and the frontline staff use it actively every day in their work to create job plans and then to record all their transactions and interactions with those job seekers. So attendance at appointments, case notes, job referrals, outcomes, investment in job seekers with resources for work, training, that sort of thing. So all of that data is then being able to be analysed and used to be fed back through the system. And importantly, it's the underpinning basis for our performance management system, which allows all providers to be compared to each other and ranked in terms of performance. It gives providers exceptional case management opportunities. It allows them to interrogate their caseload overall for each office, for different employment regions, or right down to individual consultant levels. It allows them to interrogate the caseload to see trends and changes in different job seeker cohorts that are actually coming through the door, to enable them to understand where they might need to change their service delivery methods and systems and look at some new interventions to adjust to the client needs, as well as employer information and employer vacancy information. So this has been the engine room of the frontline service delivery. But what we're moving to now, which is part of the Australian government's wider agenda to see better access for citizens to all government services through technology, is a digitalisation of a frontline employment service. So the new service that's been developed, which will be implemented fully in 2022, even though there's various trials and early formats in place now, will be centred in a digital ecosystem, which will be really driven and informed by data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and data analytics. And that will provide the main system through to make all the other parts come together and be effective. It's envisaged that it will provide government with better information to respond to the needs of job seekers, employers, as well as the supports that should be funneled through face-to-face employment services. So one of the major platforms in there will be the establishment of an online employment service. And now providers have the entire suite of job seekers on their caseload. Moving forward, the most job ready will self-manage their services on an online employment service. So they'll have access to online tools, resource, and contact centre that they can either email or phone to get assistance with their job search, but they'll largely be self-managing their requirements, including doing the reporting that they need to do, that they've fulfilled activities that are a part of their obligations for accepting income support, which is the way we operate in Australia. The new online employment service will include a very sophisticated jobs hub for employers. So it's a recruitment platform that will enable them to lodge, screen vacancies online. It's proposed that there will be a very sophisticated matching engine in that will also be able to alert job seekers when a vacancy comes up that matches their skills profile. The more disadvantaged job seekers will still continue to get a tailored service from employment service providers, and they will have access to the online employment service, but they won't be mandated to be using that as their predominant reporting system. So that's all coming together for 2022. There are trials underway. It's supposed to be an iterative process. The trials have been accelerated due to COVID. So with the flood of job seekers coming into the market, it was necessary to create an alternative because it was the entry points into employment services got jammed up and the referrals couldn't get through to the providers. So they, as an interim measure, diverted people into the test site for online employment services, and they've decided to manage some of the job seekers who have capacity to self-manage, to leave them in that service for now. And so it will grow from now until it's fully functioning in 2022. So does it work for everyone, a digital service? Well, what we've seen already, even with the early trials, is that some of the people that were put into the trials early have opted out. They really want face-to-face services. It's not just about job search, it's about someone to talk to build confidence, to build motivation, and keep sustaining them as they try to find work. So it certainly doesn't work for everybody. We know one of the greatest risks is the loss of early intervention. So if a job seeker is not suited to that platform and doesn't do well, we lose the chance to actually get in early before they become despondent or they burn opportunities that they may have been able to capture with the right support behind them. There's also quite a digital divide in Australia. We have an annual index to see the digital inclusion of Australian people. And each year it shows that people who are unemployed, people on low levels of income, and people with low education are typically digitally excluded. We have about 2.6 million of our 25 million population who don't use the internet at all. And we have about 1.3 million households that aren't connected digitally. So there's big issues there. So some of the key factors are the affordability, so access, availability of the technology and the cost of a connection and devices, the ability, digital literacy and capability are very patchwork, and accessibility for people with particular needs, such as people with disability, people who are culturally and linguistically diverse. They don't adapt well to an online platform. Our model will have some training available to improve digital capacity of those people otherwise deemed to be job ready. But whether that's going to be enough is a test that we'll have to see, and we'll get a chance now that we've advanced the rollout to actually have a look at that before we have full implementation. But I will say that with COVID, what has happened is there's been a lot of people who've been reluctant to use online, a lot of businesses that have been reluctant to use remote workers. People have made adjustments more than what we anticipated. So that has been quite positive. In the same token, those people who aren't digitally literate, if we do see continued increases in remote work, they're going to be further disadvantaged in terms of being able to obtain positions as we move forward.
Great, thanks a lot, Annette. That was really, really interesting. And we'll definitely come back to this issue around disadvantage and around how to treat disadvantaged groups in a digital environment. But right now I'd like to turn to Muriel Lentil. She's the head of government affairs at Lee Heck Harrison and the chair of the World Employment Confederation Career Management Group. So Muriel, reflecting on the comments that you've heard from Scott and Stefan and Annette, in your view, what critical areas are undergoing transformation within employment services delivery right now as a result of COVID-19?
Thanks, Jonathan, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be included in the conversation. So as you said, Jonathan, my lens on the conversation is a private employment services one. So maybe just to set the scene, because the contribution is very different, or the scale at which we operate is different than many of the panelists that we've heard, and I'm suspecting also from the audience. So our work at LHH, we serve about 500,000 workers every year globally across 60+ countries to transition, or we enable them to transition in their career. And reflecting on what I've seen on some of the questions on the chat, one piece is obviously the career guidance. So really working with the individuals to understand their aspiration, where they want to, what is the next best career step. And then there is the piece around skilling, both in terms of job search specific, but also any up and reskilling that might be required. And then the other piece is effectively and the connections to jobs. And I think that's has been partly referred to, as I could see in the Q&A part, as potentially recruitment. I think we see that as helping the person. If you think of a transition as a hiking trip, you bring the person to the start of the hikes with the right gears and the right instrument in their back pocket, as opposed to kind of making them bringing them to the interview, is really providing the visibility. Just that as a background. And as you said, Jonathan, I'm also have a second hat as the chair of the career management group at the World Employment Confederation, which is the global industry body. And so we represent roughly 2 to 3 million people we accompany every year. So slightly different from what the LinkedIns and most monsters of this world can do, which is much more on the connections to jobs. So that as a kind of a quick intro to set the scene. But clearly, I mean, to your questions, what are the critical areas undergoing transformation? I think, as in many other areas, disciplines, sectors, transformation was already ongoing before the pandemic. So COVID has, I mean, I wanted to say only, but only accelerated. So it's the pace is coming quicker. I mean, the digitization is nothing new per se. It forces us, and as we've heard from a few panelists, we've observed that in the countries where there is a natural more reluctance or greater reluctance to online, for example, and remote delivery of service. That by being forced and by noticing that it is possible, it has been working. But let me take a look at what our job seekers are, what the individuals in transition that we've supported in the last 6 months have been telling us. And there are probably 3 areas of focus. So first and foremost, I mean, the how of the delivery mode, and I think that's been discussed already, and you recognize that as a result of the health crisis, services needed to be delivered differently, or at least to some extent. For us at LHH, we were able to activate the machine already there. To within 2 weeks, we were able to move and actually close all of our offices worldwide and move every single piece of the service online. So that's kind of something we hadn't planned to do that quickly, but effectively being ready and being ready to be agile on that was a game changer for our candidates, for our job seekers. And so if I can, looking at the Q&A, maybe that's a quick Q&A section. There were a few questions about what kind of services. So let me talk about 2 things that we're doing, both in terms of how we deliver and but also what drove actually the satisfaction up. We had much better scores even, or we were able to improve the scores and satisfaction for the job seekers during this time. There are 2 things. One is we use a platform that we call Digital Talent Exchange. It is effectively a place where not only we have the possibility, or the job seekers have the possibility to post their CVs, but also they can be seen specifically by employers. So employers which we connect with and have a specific relationship with, can search for specific pools of people in specific areas. So that effectively accelerates the matching in terms of the job seekers and their CVs being seen, their profiles being seen more quickly. And that's obvious one, which is online. The other piece, and it's actually looking at the second piece of what our candidates have been telling us, is that it's all about the what and the content of what the individuals are getting. And as I said, there are three pieces. One is the coaching, and on that area we have been starting to move into an app-enabled way of connecting with our candidates. So we use an online coaching infrastructure, which is available on mobile, which increases significantly the access for some of the people who are in more remote places, potentially don't have a computer, but many of them, as we find, have a phone, a smartphone available. So that's where we can quickly and diminish the administrative burden of scheduling, etc. All do divert this to that type of instrument. So significantly, changing the way we provide coaching, and it's not just how we provided it, but also our candidates were asking for specifically more connections. So there we witnessed a very clear need and call for more connections, not just more connections with their coaches or their referees, but specifically with other people in the same area. And I think Karen, you in the beginning said something about the social distancing, and I would definitely agree. I mean, a lot of physical distancing, but actually a big call for social non-distancing. So really the connection we've seen, we connect candidates on a weekly basis in the local offices, what we call job search work teams. So teams coming together to exchange on their job search, etc. And actually, we've seen, in some regions, more than 3 times as many candidates that we had earlier in those type of teams. So a real a dynamic to and a willingness to be exchanging, talking to other people. And we also saw quite a few places where candidates actually took the initiative to have further exchange on their own without facilitation from an LHH standpoint. So I think there really, in terms of what they wanted, was a more let's say more frequent contact. And the other piece about what was appreciated, what they called for, it was the skilling. So clearly, I mean, to some extent, it's linked to them having more time, but certainly there is also a certain degree of awareness or realization that skilling is becoming more important. And we had about 3 times as many, 2 to 3 times as many bookings for our skilling offerings, and not just about the job search, but really broader areas. So quite interesting things there. And lastly, on the what, I'd say in terms of the connections to jobs, we saw a lot of people needing to change industries. And how to do that, and requiring more guidance around this, but also trying to understand and navigate this kind of foggy labor market, because yes, there were lots of people made redundant and a lot of companies struggling, but on the other hand, there are job openings out there. You may need to change location, you may need to change the industry. So that was something that, and one response that we had to that was we created what we call job bulletin in a few specific countries where it started, in particular in the US. We had the origin of that there. So it's really about providing more of a landscape of where the jobs are and who is hiring, and really trying to get them more visibility about where it is and how to get there. And the third area is probably, in terms of what we've seen, what we've observed was we witnessed more requests from people in employment, from workers contacting us. And if I think of that, particularly in Italy or in places where we saw the government's banning layoff, or so we saw a kind of a stagnation of the labor market, the artificial stagnation, and then people starting to realize that, you know, that's not going to go forever, and they need to think about what's next. And so having more and more individuals reaching out to us. There is actually a blog post, I'll put that in the chat after responding here. But we at the World Employment Confederation, we've launched a blog series with a few, you know, kind of practitioner inputs on what we have been seeing. There is one piece there if anybody is interested, because I think it's really about you know, when do we provide the service, and starting earlier. And I know for a lot of public employment services, the focus has been shifting a little bit more towards the anticipation. Now we are a bit in crisis mode, but the more we can get upstream and anticipate the needs, the better and the more efficient. So, you know, from there, maybe three kind of, to respond to your question, I'd say 3 C's in terms of areas for transformation, or certainly for more attention. One is connectivity. So connectivity in different terms, both in terms of online, the agility of meeting the people where they are. And when I say where they are, not just logistically or geographically, but also in terms of the personalization of the delivery. But also, on the other hand, you know, how do we facilitate connections between the job seekers and within the community, within the places where they are. So meeting them there and allowing them, enabling them to kind of leverage the resources they have or have not available at this stage. So connectivity is an area for additional attention and more focus moving forward from my perspective. The second C would be connections to jobs. So as we see the labor market more intransparent and confusing, you know, enabling job seekers to reach the job openings of their choice is critical. And how can we as employment services facilitate that, bring them or give more of a GPS or a compass kind of things, right, to be able to navigate that world of work. And the third piece, the third C, is probably cooperation. Unemployment has been just qualified by the World Economic Forum, as the biggest risk, the business risk, according to their survey. I think we need a, you know, massive adult learning kind of investment and in infrastructure, and to be able to respond to hopefully a massive job creation that will be launched by governments as of 2021. That might be our luxury problem, but I think you know, if we as employment services want to reach all of those people in anticipation and those in particular needs, you know, combining the public and the private services and how to reach more people and be more efficient on all sides will be critical moving forward.
Great, thanks a lot, Muriel. Super interesting points, especially around the kind of transitions and this need for skills top-ups from maybe declining sectors into sectors where there's growing hiring demand, and particularly also around what you're saying about the need to adapt. But indeed, crisis mode, I think, is definitely you know, many people are still in crisis mode right now. And I want to turn back to Scott on that, because we know that virtual service delivery has really become a key component of the crisis response. And we heard from Stefan, you know, about, you know, the PES staff people working within the PES having to basically go online and telework. So, you know, how are workforce development programs in Montana adapting to the virtual service delivery environment? What has been the impact on staffing levels in general and the skills of those staff in delivering services? And how has this made it more or less complicated to outreach to employers to generate job matches?
Sure. Couple things. Yeah, obviously, technology has become a huge deal, right? Like everybody has said, it's nothing new. This is just rapidly accelerated what we have wanted to do, what we've been able to do, and that's created some challenges. So we are using technology more extensively. We're using it to do the same things that we used to do in person, now remotely, but we're also looking to leverage it in new ways that we've never thought of. So some of the things in the United States, a lot of folks have the online learning tools, the Coursera, LinkedIn, what used to be lynda.com, metrics learning, those types of tools have been used in fits and spurts in different states and different local areas. Those, though, when the pandemic hit, a lot of those folks, Google, LinkedIn, Coursera, some of those groups stepped up and reached out to all states and made an offer to make their tools available for free for some amount of time for us to test them out and see them. Because we talked about that, but it was, I will say for my state, we talked about that, but had never taken advantage of it. I always had kind of this interest in doing it. It rose to the top of the priority. It forced that conversation. And so using those tools to engage customers differently, to offer different services than maybe we ever have before. And then now we are looking at what the sustainability of that means, what the need of that means going forward. In terms of technology, though, turning workforce centers into call centers, like workforce call centers, leveraging technology to create virtual call centers, because we don't all have the same phone system. We don't all have the same computer system. We don't have the same technology, but you can do that through different technology mediums that we never used. We're doing some of that now. We're rethinking how we provide and what we provide, talking about how we interact differently. You'd asked about the staffing level piece. The staffing level stuff in particular didn't change. What changed was how they were allocated. I have 400 staff in my division, and for when this hit, 300 of them went to do unemployment stuff. And so it was, we still had the same numbers, but what they were focused on was very different. And we've had to constantly manage that as this pandemic has evolved. Other things, businesses, the impact, as a business, the impact that COVID has had on us is no different than anybody else, right? Somebody gets sick, somebody has a family member gets sick, you have a childcare issue, those types of things, dealing with those, that has absolutely impacted our staffing levels. Not to reduce them so much, but just temporarily maybe modify how we were allocating resources. We've had to figure all that out. The remote work, a lot of folks have talked about the remote work, that has become an option. One of the challenges we had, and I think Stefan mentioned it, somebody did, our business model is not set up to support remote access for everything, right? I mentioned we don't have good technology, common technology systems, platforms, common phone platforms. We don't have a lot of mobile devices. We use hardwired desktop computers. And so just up and sending everybody home is a real challenge. We couldn't do that. We have struggled to figure that out. Going forward, we're going to do that differently so that we could deal with something like this, learn from the situation. But it has been interesting. One of the questions in the chat, speaking of staffing levels, had mentioned, do we anticipate less staff, or what does that have? What effect does this have on staffing levels? Yeah, obviously face-to-face, you're never going to get away from that. There's an element of the customer base that we serve that's always going to need face-to-face. And so we're going to have some level of brick and mortar, some way to do that, just from the comfort level of the customer. But I don't think we will have less staff. I think the way that our staff are organized within the organization will look different, right? And so what I mean by that is I could see something more of a hub and spoke, right? That we might have 4 major physical offices across the state, but we might have 200 staff spread out across the state that can travel. And like Muriel had mentioned, meeting customers where they are. In this sense, it would be the physical, rather than expecting people to drive 50 miles to find us. We would have people in those areas, those communities that they could go to, that they could meet with locally. So I think you need the same number of staff. You can provide the same thing, but it's going to look different. And then Jonathan, to the last point about business engagement, one of the things that we get out of that is we still have that personal we can still do that personal, maybe it's not in physical, but it is personal engagement with business community. with different industries in those communities. You got somebody who lives in that community, who is part of the fabric of that community, who knows those people, who has those relationships. So even if you only had 3 physical offices across the state, you could leverage expertise remotely, right? So you have somebody who knows something specific, you can use them as a subject matter expert, but you have somebody locally that has that relationship. Again, I think you need the same number of staff to be able to do that. It's just going to look different. You're going to organize it different, but I think it could also have maybe even better ultimate impacts than we have now, because it is a little bit more personal. It's a little bit more community based. It's a little bit more relatable to the customers that we're trying to reach. Great,
thanks a lot, Scott. So Stefan, I'll turn back to you, and I want to focus on the issue of serving disadvantaged groups. So we know, the complexity that some groups face in getting back into the labor market, whether it's even just having motivation to look for a job, let alone get a job. They face sometimes multiple barriers, and so employment services can't work in isolation to get a good outcome. So they must, employment services we see in a lot of our work is that they must increasingly look to kind of, adapt to the intensity of their support to address these sort of multifaceted barriers. So how is this done in Germany? And can you point to us any really good examples or regions that are being particularly successful and taking any sort of innovative approaches?
Thank you, Jonathan. I think I start exactly there. I give you an example which is working quite well, and a certain region where these approaches are relatively common and where initiatives and being proactive, combining services is a part of the tradition of delivering social services. This is Hamburg. And since in Germany everything is all about compound nouns nobody can understand, I try to explain some of them to you. I try my best, but almost all of them are completely impossible to translate, but there we go. So let's talk about the Jugendberufsagentur, which is the noun we invented for that. It's basically a youth employment agency combining services for the support of young adults and adolescents. They were first introduced in the city-state of Hamburg, as I said, a few years ago, and were actually an initiative by the then State Minister for Social Affairs, Detlef Scheele, who is today my CEO here at Federal Employment Agency. So you'll be happy that I mention it. Hamburg has been very proactive in these fields of innovation for a long time, and me being from Hamburg on my own, I've experienced that when I was a young head of a local employment agency in Hamburg as well. So in Germany, the youth support system is very sophisticated. There are more than 100, some people say it's up to 180 different support programs for helping and assisting adolescents with finding a first job, finding apprenticeships, attaining higher or highest levels of education. Each of these programs is targeting a specified segment of clients, a target group, or as we say in Germany, Zielgruppe. So there's another compound noun, we call that approach Zielgruppenförderung. Most programs are very well funded, but their overall impact on the labor market is frankly spoken very poor. Just to give you an impression, the level of needs in the relevant age groups is still very high given the amount of money spent and the overall positive labor market situation we have here in Germany. We are in the midfield, if I may put it this way, of the need levels in overall Europe, and 6 to 10 countries in Europe are performing very much better than Germany, although their labor market is performing as good as the German labor market globally. So perhaps it's time to put Zielgruppenförderung to bed, because the traditional approach, every target group has its own program, simply has failed. What's the reason for this? Well, the support structure in youth support is very fragmented. The responsibilities for the delivery of these particular programs are quite randomly scattered between local employment agencies, our own agencies, the local job centers, as we call them, which are the joint services by employment agencies and counties' social welfare services, so they are on county level, youth welfare services, and other municipal authorities, which all have various responsibilities and, of course, experts. Long story short, this is a mess. Coordination is a nightmare if it's taking place at all. So a youth employment agency is a model for addressing that problem by combining efforts. It is more or less a loose joint venture of parts of all the local and federal authorities and municipal authorities responsible for the labor market integration of young people. The idea is to round up and combine these services in one single place, ideally in one single building under one roof. So specialists of all these services can work hand in hand, developing individual case management solutions for each single individual. Ideally, they will try to combine the various instruments and the budgets of the Zielgruppenförderung for every single case. So addressing the specific challenges, the multiple challenges of each client, especially with the needs, who often have these multiple challenges and individual deficits. This tends to work much better, and integration success tends to be higher. The other significant advantage of such an approach is customer friendliness. You see, clients don't have to navigate through this maze of processes and agencies and application processes and so on, that parents don't have to. Instead, youth employment agencies allow for, if you will, a one-stop shop approach for young clients and their families. So you will ask me, does it work? Well, on the sake of my CIO, of course it works, but there are certain conditions critical to success. Perhaps it's something to talk about more eloquently or more specifically in the Q&A, but I would try to stop here for saving time.
Great, thanks a lot. So just going, before we get to the Q&A, just remind everybody if, if you do have questions, please enter them. We're just gonna, one more question to Annette and one more question to Maria, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So Annette, again, focusing on disadvantaged groups. And Australia is quite an interesting system in the sense that you segment services or cater the intensity of services based on level of disadvantage, because given the streaming system that you have. So maybe you could just provide a bit of details on that. And what do you see, even given that system that you're adopting the intensity services, as the main challenges in getting good employment outcomes? And can you give us any sort of concrete examples of providers that have done something, achieving success in this area around serving disadvantaged groups?
Yes, certainly. We utilise what we call the job seeker classification instrument when a new income support recipient approaches our income support agency, Centrelink. They are given this short survey of questions, which gathers information about factors which enables a prediction of the person's risk of long-term unemployment. And that's the principal tool we use to ration services. Job Active, which is our main program, has 3 streams of services. Stream A is the largest, and it is for the most job-ready job seekers. Then we have Stream B for people with moderate barriers to employment. And then we have Stream C, which is for people who have multiple and complex barriers to employment. And that's principally determined through the classification instrument. And where necessary, they also have supplementary assessments with allied health professionals for issues such as substance use, homelessness, and disability, just as the second measure to see if they need a different specialist program and to really assess the level of their work capacity. So that's what comes into the service. But I have to say, it's a relative measure. And it's not an actual assessment of the individual. So we do end up with job seekers who are experiencing circumstances like homelessness put into the job ready category of Stream A. So it's not an absolute and individual measure, which is what employment service providers have been advocating the classification system should be. It should be an individual assessment of actual need rather than a relative assessment as we currently have at the moment. So that brings with it quite a few problems. One of the issues that certainly was there during COVID is some of those supplementary assessments that people needed to really determine where they should be referred to and engaged to weren't available during the crisis. And just reflecting on Muriel's presentation, I will mention too that system that enables employment services, the employment services system, enable providers to move quite seamlessly from face-to-face delivery to remote services and keeping all their data and everything in place. And it also enabled people to be case managed from across the country because they had that central database with all of the information. So if a particular provider clustered a workforce in parts of Australia where the containment measures weren't as great, they actually created call centres to reach out to different job seekers. They could actually pick up any of the issues where the workforce in other parts of the country were having difficulty engaging. More specifically on the question, one of the early issues was engagement during COVID, and that's still unfolding, where we had, understandably, lots of job seekers who were reluctant to look for work, were reluctant to continue servicing even online for the prospect of looking for work during the peak, particularly where they themselves had vulnerabilities. They were living in a house with people that were vulnerable. They had childcare issues because we had homeschooling during the lockdown and confinement. And in fact, that's just ended in the state that I'm in now in Australia. So we've, for basically 6 months, had lockdown provisions with only 4 reasons allowed to leave your home. So there was a lot of job seekers through that who were quite anxious, and still quite anxious about infection and putting themselves or people in their household at risk. So beyond that, now we have some areas that their placement rates, employment service placement rates, have actually recovered to pre-COVID levels already, but it's very, very patchwork. We have communities that are tourist communities. They survive on that. That's the predominant part of their economy. So really looking at strategies to how they can reinvent and recover and create jobs. So at the beginning of COVID, we had about 800,000 people lose their job within the first month and apply for income support. There was a lot more who lost their job but didn't apply for income support, so they didn't actually join the employment services system. So one of my questions around is, how do we access some of those people who may be particularly mature age job seekers who lost their job, who just think that's the end of their working life and haven't engaged. You know, at the same time that we've seen that influx of people, the sectors that were hardest hit by COVID in Australia, where the jobs were lost, represent the sectors that have annually made up half our employment service placements. They're the biggest supporters of diversity and disadvantage. So what we've done is we've lost a lot of areas that we don't know is going to come back, that have offered the sorts of opportunities that have suited disadvantaged job seekers well. So we really have a big challenge in terms of looking at different opportunities. And the biggest challenge is that the human capital development is actually being able to get people to look at their skills and their aspirations and reorientate to where the jobs are actually going to be. And I will add too that we've also had that escalation of automation, which is, you know, really had a great hold in areas like logistics in Australia, warehousing work. Again, another area of the economy where we, you know, that has embraced disadvantaged job seekers. And we don't know that any of those jobs, well, certainly not the automated jobs, but even in the other industries, the food, hospitality, that's going to be a very slow recovery. So unless we can reorientate disadvantaged workers and build their capacity to do other areas in the labour market, we really face a huge threat of increased long-term unemployment and very long-term unemployment, particularly in the context of having a very large pool of candidates who are much more experienced than the disadvantaged people that were unemployed prior to COVID. We also have an issue that a lot of the employment in Australia has become casualised, so it's less than full-time hours. So we've got a lot of people that are getting by on a few hours that aren't engaged in the system. That's also a longer-term concern for those people, because if they can't have a sustaining wage, a decent level of wage, that's going to be a real issue. So human capital development has to be a significant part of our recovery if we want an inclusive recovery and not leave people behind. That really calls for very good labour market intelligence in that local area to make sure that you're actually forecasting and looking at what's needing and emerging in the market so that you can develop people consistent with those opportunities, so you're not setting people up for failure. And there is another big digital initiative happening in Australia with the development of a jobs, education and data infrastructure system, which is our big JEDI project is what it's called. But that tool, when it's developed, is about mapping and now casting skills demands and mapping that to training agenda to be able to feed really good information to players like employment services to make sure that we can put forward the best options to job seekers in terms of real data and real analytics about what's happening. The other area that we really need to look at is the government in Australia has already initiated a range of recovery mechanisms, wage subsidies, increased subsidies for traineeships and apprenticeships, increased subsidies for youth for employment. But they're not universal across the board in terms of all groups of disadvantage. So there's significant groups that have been left out. We really do need that inclusion lens across all of the subsidies. So rather than just focus on general subsidies, we need maybe a general subsidy plus then an additional subsidy to make sure or disadvantaged job seekers to make sure that they have an extra leg up in terms of competition in the labour market with employers. Going from there. The other thing that is really important is that the partnership approach to addressing the barriers that people with disadvantage face, it's and a local focus. So a good example I'll provide to you that's coming through, and the partnership element is what's the difference when these projects work and they don't work, and they're embedded in employer demand. So the employment service providers in this particular program, this is one example, but this is happening in many locations across Australia, partnering with the employer to identify exactly what sort of skills that they need, getting a commitment to employ disadvantaged job seekers. So it's a specific target. The employment service providers then develop a tailored pre-employment plan around what that employer needs. One example was with one of our large supermarket chains. So during COVID, when we had lots of panic buying and no one could find toilet paper, the supermarkets were really looking for extra staff. So it was a great opportunity to partner up and say, and why don't you give disadvantaged job seekers a go? So this group, we ended up attracting 15 very disadvantaged job seekers, putting them through an online a pre-employment training course, normally delivered face-to-face. We were worried that the candidates might not be able to handle it. They did fantastic, so that was great. On the completion, 15 started work with the supermarket. There was planned rotation throughout the supermarket so that each of the candidates could work in different areas. The store manager was constantly checking in on them, and they used that experience to then match the 15 candidates to the areas of the supermarket, whether it was back of house, front register, deli departments, all that sort of, and make the right match. And it was bringing all of this wraparound support. The employer provided a workplace mentor for each of the candidates as well, so they had a colleague that they could work with in the store, and employment services made sure that they continued to support the participants throughout the training, of course, and while they were in work, and they drew in other community partners, social services, or other welfare support for individuals as they needed to. But the partnership worked really well with a clear commitment up front about providing that support for targeting disadvantaged job seekers, and it worked really well. And the sustainability likelihood is really great for those candidates as a result of that. They're really embedded well in the workplace.
Great, thanks a lot, Annette. So I'm just conscious of time because we have 10 minutes left, and we want to give Yves-Marie 5 minutes to say some closing remarks. So Muriel, if okay for you, I'm just going to move to some of the Q&As and actually ask you one of the first questions. So one of the broad themes I'm seeing from the Q&As is this, pressure right now because of social distancing measures to deliver digital services, but the need for face-to-face, especially amongst long-term job seekers and severely disadvantaged clients. And many of you, Scott, Stefan, Annette, and Muriel have touched on this point. So, I mean, Muriel, what are you hearing about this kind of trade-off between digital and face-to-face, more intensive delivery in your services? We know that private employment services are often contracted out to deliver to disadvantaged groups. So what are the experiences you're hearing from the field on that, this trade-off between face-to-face and digital?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and I was in preparing this conversation today. I chatted with the delivery teams across the world, and quite a few said to me, we were very reluctant. Our consultant were not willing to, right, in the beginning. But I think really the experience has been massively positive, particularly from the candidate. The candidate are telling us, the job seekers are telling us that yes, this is, the quality has improved. So we have more frequent interaction, as opposed to when you have face-to-face, you have a longer interaction and less frequent. So I think that's, thinking about it as not just changing the means of the connection, but changing the setup or the setting, right? So I think that's probably been, let's say now on the let's say general population we support, has been a game changer, I think. And so it's not just say, okay, now we have a phone call or we have a video call, but we change the frequency and the type of interaction, and diversify as well. I think on the population that we support in terms of long-term unemployment and unemployed, for example, in France, we have quite a few different populations across regions in France that we support. There we had slightly different ways of approaching it. I think overall the feedback has been similar, that yes, they're getting even more ready to do so, but the barriers, particularly for those who are not, who don't have any access to a computer or phone, then this is getting really in the way of more frequent contact.
Great,
for the others, yeah.
Great, thanks a lot. So, Stefan, and I guess for the questions going forward now, if we'll try to get through a couple here just in the next 3 minutes. Stefan, to you, one of the questions we had was around how employment services can cooperate better with local authorities or city level governments to support job creation. Any thoughts on that from the German perspective? And one of the other questions to add to that was, if you think about what is the most effective active labor market policy to activate vulnerable groups, is it job guarantees or public works? Are those an option that you see within the kind of German delivery arrangements?
The question takes more than 3 minutes to answer, actually. Well, I think in comparison, the approach I pointed out with the youth employment agencies is the most viable approach, to combine various different approaches and support schemes, be it subsidies, be it training program, be social coaching, whatever, fitting to a particular case, rather than to develop a new program and find a new way of active labor market policies. Because as I say, the wheel has already been invented. There is nothing new out there. So I think we're well advised to just take a step back and look at the individual case and do what's appropriate for the individual case. That's what we've learned over the last 20, 25 years. So the individual approach, I think, is more viable and more sustainable in the long run in terms of long-term integration than all sorts of labor market policies, mass programs, targeted programs, Zielgruppenförderung. I think that's the bottom line.
Great, thanks. And thanks for being concise with your answer, because I realized it could have been a lot longer. So with that, I think what we'll do is we'll now turn to the closing remarks. I mean, apologies on behalf of the OECD for some of the questions we didn't get to, but I think we did have a lot of high response rate to this, so it shows the need to keep the conversation going. So we'll be looking to organize more webinars and dig deeper on some of the topics that we've highlighted here in this really interesting conversation. So with that, I would like to pass it to Yves-Marie Mosseret with the WAPES Secretariat to give us some closing remarks. So Yves-Marie, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It was a pleasure for the World Association of Public Employment Services, WAPES, to support the OECD in preparing this important and timely webinar. Our association, I will speak a little bit about WAPES, I represent as Executive Secretary, is the only global network of decision makers in the field of public employment service. It brings together 80 public employment agencies in all continents and over 1 million staff from around the world. WAPES is based on the values of its members: non-for-profit orientation, transparency, accessibility, and equal opportunities and service orientation. As the local level is key for job search, hiring, and tailored active labor market programs, I've been following the webinar with great interest. From a point of view of WAPES, of public service delivery, I found, and I had to make a choice, the following points particularly important. Creating new opportunities through digital transformation. Digital transformation, it's not new, but in particular, extending online service through multifunctional platform bears a huge potential as it increases transparency and accessibility. This changed the profile of service in local PES branches, shifting information and other simple administrative functions to digital self-help tools. Maintaining or building of strong locally anchored PES base. Progress in online services does not automatically reduce the importance of a strong network of local PES branches and of competent staff for various reasons. You mentioned a few of them. Not all regions have the adequate technical infrastructure. Not all citizens, job seekers, as well as employers have the adequate digital skills. Furthermore, many unemployed have problems requiring more intensive supports in terms of counseling and social services, and more intensive support involving other social services. How to shape local services? As employment is mostly local, employment services need sufficient autonomy to adjust services and active labor market measures to local conditions. Further, well-functioning partnership and cooperation structures with all relevant stakeholders, employers, chambers, social partners, municipal services, private employment services, training providers are key to deliver good labor market information and user-oriented services. To conclude with a reflection on digital transformation, it is important to shape this according to job seekers and employers' needs and along a user journey. Cost saving alone and building IT tools in isolation risk to deepen the digital divide. And we have heard quite a lot of examples today. strengthen both public employment services at local level and digital transformation is very relevant for all PES worldwide. Today, we have got a good insight into examples from wealthier countries and modern PES. In many countries, the situation is different. The network of branches is thin, resources for service delivery scarce, the labor market extremely difficult, and the level of e-governance low. Looking at the European Union demonstrate, in the EU, the share of citizens that used information from government websites during the last 12 months range from a high of 90% in Denmark to a low of 9% in other countries. The average in the European Union is 45%. Still a way to go, even in Europe. Therefore, the future lies in two-pronged strategy, at least, to improve digital transformation and at the same time to strengthen service capacities and to create the adequate, maybe more, local branches or contact points in other public buildings to ensure reasonable access. In line with this, WAPES has just launched a week ago a worldwide pilot project, the so-called SAMPES, a methodology for quality management building upon a structured self-assessment of PES, similar to the method used in the European PES network. Finally, from a WAPES point of view, we consider future cooperation with the OECD on how to modernize service delivery at local level as a promising way forward. To conclude, I would like to express my sincere thanks to all who made this online event possible, our speakers who provided us with new insight and food for thought, the audience, and last but not least, the OECD for hosting an excellent organization. Today, I cannot end with wishing you, all of you, a safe trip home. Let me wish you instead good resilience in these challenging times. My hope is to meet you in person next year, some of you, not all of you, and to discuss further all the topics we discussed today and other topics of relevance for employment services. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Yves-Marie. So just ask the panelists and speakers to stay on the line. We're going to end the webinar, but I just want to conclude by saying, once again, a big thank you on behalf of the OECD and a big thank you to WAPES and to the 90 people or so who are still online. If you have any questions or follow-up, please get in touch with us. Our contact is on the event webpage. And some of the panelists, Scott in particular, has offered to kindly follow up some of the questions. So please just get in touch with either Karen or myself, and we'll be happy to follow up and get more information with you. And this is an area of work where we want to continue the comparative analysis that we're doing. So if you find this work interesting, please also get in touch, and we're happy to continue exchanging going forward. So thanks a lot for everybody for participating. So again, the panelists, if you could just stay on so we could do a digital group shot, that would be great. Thanks.